Yeah, I can do that.
You are amazing. Thank you. And it shows Richard needs to be made into a panelist. Richard, that's very odd. Let me make sure you get that panelist link again. I'm not sure why that happened. Thank you all for your patience. Again, we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, Richard, I'm going to resend you a link in just a second here, and you should be able to come in through the backstage entrance. Let me grab that. Okay. Okay. Again, just working through a bit of a technical difficulty at the moment. Thank you for your patience. My name is Jess Alvarez Parfrey. I'm the Executive Director of Transition US, and we're really happy to be hosting this event this evening. I'm just trying to make sure that our other panelists can make it onto the stage. Yeah. And for those who are intrigued by these kinds of things, today is the start of Mercury retrograde. So communication, tech glitches abound from what I understand. So let me see. Hi. Okay. Richard. Okay. Let me try one more time and see if this gets through. Okay, wonderful. Richard, you should have just received your panelist link, and hopefully you can join us very shortly. And yes, to answer Luke's question, in the chat, Jonathan Parfrey is my father-in-law. So climate activism is definitely a big part of my family. And there's Richard. Okay.
Yeah, it's giving me a message that I can't start my video because you have to let me do that.
All right, let me give you the special privileges. I've just made you a co-host, so you should be able to bring yourself on camera.
There we go.
Wonderful.
Hey.
Success.
Hi, David. I've been waiting
Richard.
around since a quarter till. So.
Oh my goodness. Well, we're here now, and gratitude to you
Yeah,
both.
Here we are.
Really excited. Yeah, and thank you again for folks joining us this evening. Thank you for your patience. We're really excited to dive into the conversation. Again, I'm going to go ahead and do some bios and a little bit of framing. So this evening, you are joining us for a very special event. I also want to really honor the fascinating web of connections that have led us all to share space here this evening. Again, my name is Jess Alvarez Parfrey. I'm a mother, partner, student, and together with my family, I'm growing in relationship with 44 acres of land located in the ancestral territories of the Cahuilla people. Today, I'm calling in from Central Pomo lands in Northern California. And again, on behalf of Transition US, I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight. It's a privilege and tremendous gift to be able to gather together and share in a conversation between two very thoughtful, innovative, and dedicated agents of cultural transformation. Tonight, our discussion will flow from an acknowledgement of the 50-year anniversary of the Limits to Growth report, originally published in 1972 by Meadows, Randers, and Barons. The report carries a complex cultural history and has been hailed as prescient, groundbreaking, and denounced as alarmist, garbage, and utter nonsense. The report offered a framework and highlighted the dangers of resource depletion, pollution, industrial outputs, and the fragility of a global economic system tethered to a need for exponential growth. And today we'll be diving deeper into that report, but let me go ahead and shift out into our bios and introduce our guests here. So David Holmgren is the co-originator of the permaculture concept following publication of Permaculture 1, co-authored with Bill Mollison in 1978. David is globally recognized as a leading ecological thinker, teacher, writer, and speaker promoting permaculture as a realistic, attractive, and powerful alternative to dependent consumerism. Other key publications include Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, and Future Scenarios, How Communities Can Adapt to Peak Oil and Climate Change. And finally, Retro Suburbia, The Downshifter's Guide to a Resilient Future. Welcome, David. Really happy to meet you here today. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Richard. So Richard is a senior fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute and is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He is the author of 14 books, including some of the seminal works on society's current energy and environmental sustainability crisis, including The Party's Over, Oil, War, and the Fate of Industrial Societies, Power Down, Options and Actions for a Post-Carbon World, Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels, and Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival. So I'd like for us to shift into an organic conversation. So let's start at the beginning. I would love to hear from each of you. Where were you when you first read the Limits to Growth report? Do you recall that experience? What was that initial influence or impact, and how has that informed your work today? And I'm going to go ahead and start off with you, Richard, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I read the book when I was 21 years old, 1972. And so this was my first real clue that the world was on a fundamentally unsustainable path. And I really didn't know what to do with that information for a number of years afterward. I was kind of floundering around looking for ways to piece together what this meant. And it led me into, some relatively fruitless explorations. But eventually by the 1990s, I had realized that it really all came down to fossil fuels. And so I've spent the last 30 years and a little more, mostly looking into our global fossil fuel dependency, how that arose, what that means, what's the future of it, and so on. So yeah, and it's really only I'd say in the last few months that I've gone back to the book and reread it and unearthed a lot more understanding than I recalled from my previous immersions in it, and I'd be happy to talk about that.
Wonderful. Over to you, David.
Wow, thanks, Richard, for that. Well, I was 17 when The Limits to Growth was published in my final year of high school, with huge change in Australia after 23 years of conservative government, a most radical progressive government elected, and Australia leaving the Vietnam War, which had filled my childhood because my parents were leading activists against that war. And I suppose I was on a trajectory which was away from my parents' radical activism, trying to stop the bad things happening in the world, and more, how are we going to create the world we want? And after a year traveling around Australia, I joined what I think was the most radical experiment in tertiary education in Australia's history, the Environmental Design School in Hobart, under the leadership of visionary architect Barry McNeil. And it was in that first year of that ferment of that course that attracted all the radicals and dissidents from design schools all over Australia that I came across this work that, you know, hadn't sort of really been on my radar at all. And it was really as part of the partnership with Bill Mollison, independent of that course actually, and the immersion in the ideas of permaculture, that looking at those sources for the need for a complete redesign of global society, that the Limits to Growth report was clearly the seminal work. And it was a incredibly deep influence and framework, which I would candidly admit we projected into that work more immediate consequences through the oil crises of 73 and 79. We thought, now that society understands these actual hard non-negotiable limits, markets will start to build in these realities into prices. And many of us expected that by the 80s, there would be this revolutionary change and ideas like permaculture would be thrust into the fore of that change. Obviously, things panned out much more complex than that, but I still reference that report as the most important scientific report in modern history.
Wonderful. And I really love reading in the chat how folks first encountered this report, kind of that moment in your life when you come across this really complex and overwhelming information. So my next question for consideration by you both is just, I mean, getting to the point, like, what are the most salient, most useful kind of insights coming out of the report that could be applied to the current moment that we're in? We're 50 years on from the initial publication of the report, 2 years into a global pandemic. We're feeling the squeeze. So what insights would you hope to see employed and made actionable as quickly as possible?
The report, of course, was written 50 years ago. So as I've had discussions about this with Dennis Meadows, and he acknowledges that the window for the kinds of global top-down efforts that were implied by the report and explicitly called for by the authors of the report, the window for those kinds of efforts has pretty much closed. And so Dennis has spent the last number of years really advocating community resilience as the most meaningful response to our, approaching confrontation with limits. There's a lot that can be said about that initial report that most people don't understand. For one thing, it's not just about one scenario where the world crashes into resource limits and pollution limits and so on. The authors of the report did everything they could to create a scenario in which collapse doesn't happen. They envisioned, doubling Earth's resources or even taking away resource limits altogether. They tried to model the effect of various policies of, reducing population growth or reducing consumption and so on. And it was only when they were able to model them, plenty of resources and abundant top-down government efforts to rein in consumption and population growth, that they were able to approach a kind of steady state scenario outcome. Well, obviously, we haven't done those things in the last 50 years. Population is not growing as fast as it was 50 years ago, but we're still adding roughly 80 million people a year. We haven't reduced consumption growth. Actually, the economy has just continued to grow pretty much at the same rate as the standard run scenario, the one that showed, collapse. So, it's not that there are no things that policymakers could do from a top-down standpoint. There are still things they could do. But at this point, in order to avert a kind of collapse scenario, those things would be extremely, and they would be perceived as being extremely severe in terms of the impacts of those efforts on people's lives. They would be perceived as incredibly intrusive governmental regulations. And, the likelihood of world leaders doing those things at this point is extremely small. So, where does that leave us? As I said at the beginning of my comment, I think Dennis has thought this through pretty well, and his advice is, to improve resilience at the nodes of societal operation that are most critical to the survival and well-being of the most people and of ecosystems. And those nodes are most accessible at the community level, given the fact that global top-down efforts have been put off beyond the point where they can realistically be applied.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what Richard has said, and obviously permaculture in its approaches are primarily that bottom-up individual, household, community level approaches building up into larger structures. So it's like a normal economic or community development process starts at the simple component parts and builds towards that. So it's, in that sense, it's building to some extent a parallel system in the shadow of a rigidified, dysfunctional system. But I think there's also, going back to what Richard was saying about the efforts of the modelers to look at making all the changes that would be necessary to achieve some sort of steady state. And the final sort of hopeful scenario was that where they modified all of these different parameters and the whole system seemed to move out at least to the limits of modeling of 2100 in a steady state. And what I think is most interesting about that is that what I call the sustainability mainstream has never really acknowledged that that's where the vision of what most people would call a green tech transformation, where we make all these changes and we can more or less maintain most of the benefits of modern industrial society transformed and deal with the equity issues and whatever, and move into a state of what people would call sustainability, where the system maintains itself. And that is actually the origins, unacknowledged origins of modern sustainability concepts. And that it really literally is that last scenario. Now, in my own work, certainly over the last 20 years since the publication of Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, I actually emphasized the idea of energy descent along with a few other authors, so that this is actually an idea that the future will be composed of actual continuous change, but just in very different directions from what we're familiar with. Because I was already seeing that the hopes for that final steady state scenario were really highly unlikely. There seem to be so many limits to that, as well as the default scenario that most of society is still wedded to, of what that I call techno explosion, where everything gets more complex. We gain greater power over nature, and of course go to the stars, you know, and the perpetual growth. That I always thought that highly unlikely, but I still had to countenance some miracle breakthrough in energy technology at least 20 years ago that could allow that. And I suggested that the steady state seemed as unlikely as the techno explosion, almost less likely. And that was the core of my critique of mainstream sustainability, but it was informed by that modeling and how extreme that needed to be to achieve the steady state. So I then positively embraced, and in a way, permaculture was positively embracing a world of less from the beginning, and saying, if this is inevitable, humans are incredibly adaptable. How do we go with that flow and work out an equitable, engaging world for that? And there's plenty of historical precedents for that, including quite sophisticated societies like Edo, Japan, of how do you allow for human creativity and possibility, but within really tight constraints.
Thank you both for those answers. Just conversation around equity and building community resilience. As I'm reminded of a quote from your book, Richard, Power. I'll go ahead and read it. Is it possible to change our relationship with power so as to avert ecological catastrophe while also dramatically reducing social inequality and the likelihood of political economic collapse? And I'm very curious, David, how permaculture can help us to reassess our relationship to power. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Richard first.
Right. Well, as David was just saying, we do have the innate capability of living within limits. I sometimes come across very well-informed people who have a cynical attitude that, well, you know, human beings are just genetically programmed to always want more and to get as much power as we possibly can, and so therefore it's not even worth trying to confront our situation head on. But actually, that was the main point of my new book, Power, is to look at how, in fact, all of nature is programmed to deal with limits. Yes, it's true that there is the phenomenon of overshoot, population overshoot, consumption overshoot, and various, you know, problems that result from that. But overall, you know, organisms, ecosystems, and human societies have a lot of experience in homeostasis, staying within bounds in order to permit thriving for, you know, as many as possible, as long as possible. Where we humans have gotten away from that is especially in the last few hundred years with the European conquest of the rest of the world. Suddenly this, you know, one relatively small group of people gained a lot of power, and there are, you know, historical and technological reasons for this, over a lot of other people, and then developed the ability to use fossil fuels. And fossil fuels, being this huge, vast source of energy, created this sense that the sky's the limit. There are no limits, in fact. And of course, President Reagan said this explicitly, that, you know, because we human beings are so smart, there are no, of course, he was addressing the Limits to Growth report when he was saying this, and doubts about sustainability of growth and civilization. And he, after Carter, you know, made some speeches in which he said, look, we're going to have to tighten our belts, put on the sweaters, lower our thermostats, and respond to energy limits in a disciplined, coordinated way. Reagan comes along and says, no, 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 we don't have to do that. We're smart. We deserve the stars, basically. And this attitude came from decades of growth in energy from fossil fuels that enabled us to do miraculous things, including, sending rockets to the moon and so on. So in effect, fossil fuels have been the biggest tragedy in human history. Even though they have enabled us to do miraculous things, they've created completely unsustainable expectations about what we can do in the future. And of course, there's all the side effects of, carbon emissions, changing climate, and so on. But really, I think when we look back on our time, the biggest tragedy that fossil fuels entailed was this shift in attitude away from the innate capacity to limit ourselves and work together to solve human problems for the most number of people, instead just shooting for the moon, quite literally.
Thank you for that, Richard. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, David.
Yeah, well, it was great to read Richard's latest book. I must admit, I haven't read all his impressive output over the years. Found The Party's Over was, of course, a very informative and influential book, and many of his other writings. But I think Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival is, a masterwork, Richard. I think it's amazing in yes, this focus on energy and its rate of release, and linking power at the biophysical level, the things that actually create the stars and create ecosystems and created us, right through to all those concepts of power in politics, power in our own being, and ego that we think of as completely disembodied or disconnected from those, and the way you bring those two back together. The issue of the limits to exercise of power and the restraint that can be seen in basically all indigenous and traditional cultures of place. Yes, I agree with you completely, and like the example I gave of Japan, that this has actually been the norm of human history. And then often with civilizations, there's been these explosive breakouts where, yes, amazing things are done, and then some of those survive and are incorporated into human culture, but a lot of them end up in the dustbin of history. And of course, we have lots of evidence of those precursors, and the most dramatic and extensive one, of course, was Rome. And I wanted to reference another thing from 1972, an article by Edward Goldsmith in The Ecologist magazine, an ecological interpretation of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And I also read that in 1974. And that gave me this amazing picture of what Rome was in the latter period, and how similar it was to what modern society was going through. But I think in terms of the issue of restraint, there's also this, as Richard identifies in his book, the maximum power principle, strongly articulated by my greatest influence and intellectual mentor, which was Howard Odum, the American systems ecologist, that the systems that get and most effectively use power tend to prevail in nature. And depending on how you measure that power, that seems to be the case. But Odom very clearly showed that one of the ways that individual animals, whole populations, species, cultures maximize power is to actually feed back into the environmental systems that they are a part of to maximize power at all hierarchical levels. And that this is a way of understanding this endless push in nature and humanity towards power, and yet the need to constrain. But those two can be actually integrated when we see that that the behavior is actually maximizing power in the long term and for all hierarchical levels, from the microbes to the whole living earth. And this is the problem of elites in all complex societies, that they lose the wisdom that they are there to serve the system, to maximize power for all levels, and they start to believe that the purpose of the system is them. And that's what we associate with this greed, this, gathering in. So I, in some ways, would go even further than you have, Richard, in that balance between the problem and the ubiquity of maximum power and the need for restraint, that in some ways there's not a conflict when we see it as maximum power for all levels in the system. And when we're thinking about that as the whole earth, clearly, that requires that we do things that, restrain us and in service to that larger whole. And it's seeing that larger whole all the time. And of course, this is the wisdom that Indigenous and traditional cultures of place, and most of the spiritual traditions actually directly or indirectly tell us. So I agree with Richard, there's plenty of evidence of humans having this capacity to deal with these issues.
In the book, I call this the optimum power principle.
Yes, yes.
I'm curious, would you describe this optimum power principle as similar to regeneration, or at least how that meme is being proliferated right now? I'm thinking Paul Hawkins' work, Regeneration. So the system has limits, and yes, it's looking to into the future and really taking that distance scale. Richard, you looked ready to respond.
Oh yeah, well, I don't have a lot to say on that score other than, yeah, it's the concept of a regenerative economy, which is, that word is really taking off as a, I think, a replacement for the idea of just sustainability. It's a little more attractive, has a little more cachet. Fine, I think it's a great word. But the idea that, of course, that the economy needs to regenerate is obvious, and that's what nature does. But when we create an economy that is linear, where we're just extracting raw materials, using energy to transform them into goods, and then at the end of the day, disposing of those goods as waste and pollution, then obviously we don't have a regenerative system, and that's the problem. That's what we're currently stuck with.
Absolutely. David, do you have any response or reflections after that?
I think I suppose there's many different ways of trying to see the positives in the hard realities, and different ways of coming to terms with new evidence, as well as the very important focus on yeah, the task is to regenerate nature's capacity and also to regenerate human capacity at the scales that actually make sense. And one of the ways I've played with this quite, in ironic way is dealing with the, if you like, the negativity of the degrowth idea or energy descent, or how do you actually sort of, sell this message, especially into a culture that is, been so obsessed in the way it is. And one of my challenges from my retro suburbia work is to suggest that perhaps half the growth in GDP in lifetime of people like me and Richard has actually been completely false, not in the sense that it's more legal litigation or car accidents, which of course all contribute to GDP, but in the sense that activity has been moved out of the household and community non-monetary economies into the monetary economies. And it's been called economic growth. So for example, people buying their lunch at work rather than making it at home, no more lunches are created by that process, but the activity has been monetarized. And if we can show, and if it's actually self-evident for people that it's better in their interests, it's better for the whole of society, and it's way better for the environment and more efficient in terms of resource use to move at least some of that economic activity back into the household and community non-monetary economies, largely ruled by gift and reciprocity rather than monetary exchange, then we can do that and call it growth. And that means I'm pro-growth. Now this is sort of like, laughing at ourselves, but it's actually also a serious strategy that we need radical contraction of the corporate globalized end of the economy. And we need stabilization and restructuring of the small business self-employment end of the economy. And in over affluent countries like Australia and the United States, we need this explosive growth in the non-monetary household and community economies. So that's a way of both grappling with this issue of growth versus non-growth, and also the issue of regulation versus deregulation. Because at the bottom, we need this massive freeing up of people to do things at the same time that we need, but don't seem to be likely to get, this major contraction at the larger globalized scale. So we can sort of integrate this sort of pulling apart of, do things have to grow or do they have to contract? And do things need more regulation or do they need less regulation? And in that way, that pulls what appear to be polar opposites politically often into a, no, there is some, sensible reconstruction that's at least possible and that we can enact on. And even if those don't achieve any of the larger goals, they stabilize and work as adaptive strategies at the smaller scale.
Yeah, we desperately need that common ground, politically speaking, because one of the problems that we're facing as growth comes to an end is that everything is becoming politicized, and people are blaming each other for the sort of falling apart that they're starting to see around them, and the blame game really doesn't help anyone. So the more we can articulate strategies that, is that a left strategy? Is that a right strategy? I don't know. This is something different. I think the more helpful we're likely to be.
Wonderful. I'm seeing some really thoughtful questions in the chat, and I'm curious if Richard and David would be interested in shifting into a kind of Q&A portion, and we can kind of riff off of what's coming up for folks. Does that sound good? Or are there any
Sure.
other comments that you would like to share to continue to ground us? Let's go. All right. So the question I'm going to read out here is from Jude. I'm going to go ahead and say, oh, wonderful. And there's a really wonderful, oh, I'm sorry, Jamie. Thoughts about how we deal with Earth population. So it's not just a simple numbers issue, since some pollute hundreds of times more than others, namely those of us in the quote unquote first world, industrialized world. What's a useful framework here that's the least harmful for the most people, i.e. just? Curious about your thoughts on this great question from JB.
Well, there's so much that can be said about population, especially since there's so little said about it in the mainstream, including in the environmental movement these days. Almost nothing is said about population. Population is one of the fundamental limiting factors, and we should have been taking it seriously all these last 50 years. And it's not just a matter of, white men in wealthy countries telling people, brown people in poor countries, not to have so many children. That's not what this is all about at all. Because the reality is that people in poor countries with high population growth rates are going to suffer more as a result of that. And reducing those population growth rates is one of the things, most obvious consequential things that can be done to reduce present and future human suffering on this planet. So from that perspective, it's a huge issue. Sadly, though, we're at the situation where, population is not an issue that can be changed rapidly. It's a slow moving trend. And we've, as I say, we've lost decades on it, and there's no likelihood that we can, flip a switch at this point and get, human population to within long-term carrying capacity. Currently, we're at 8 billion. Who knows what long-term carrying capacity is, whether it's, there are estimates all over the place from 1 or 2 billion on up. So, obviously there are things that we can do, like improving the social status and educational level and economic opportunities of women, especially in poor countries, changing cultural narratives about family size and reproduction in Catholic countries. And, all of these things are controversial. And there are good people who are working to do these things, but as I said, time is working against us in being able to make much of a difference very quickly.
Yeah, the thought that I would have on population is to look at some of the examples of societies going through sort of unplanned contraction, like the collapse of the Soviet Union and the increase in the death rate in those countries, a lot of it due to ill health, alcoholism, depression, criminal activity, and a lot of it affecting older people, and younger people actually adapting a bit to the chaos of the new world that emerged in Russia in the 1990s, incidentally, as the West raped and pillaged the economic resources of Russia. But in that context, like, there wasn't this mass die-off of population, because often when people talk about population and trying to positively, proactively from the top do something about that, and then, no, this is not possible, and then that sort of leading to that dark thinking about die-off scenarios, which are actually more likely is the sort of larger scale modeling of what happened in the Soviet Union, reducing population. And that's not a very positive scenario, but it is one where people adapt in different ways, rather than just this bleak sort of end of the world sort of thing. And thinking of how to deal with other countries like Japan and Italy, where there is this, declining population, aging of the population, and at the same time recognizing that people are the asset which is in abundance in the world. Whether you like it or not, people have got to be seen as the asset. Not that we want more of them, but how to use what already exists. And that ranges from very simple things around children are useful contributors rather than just this burden until they're, I don't know, done their PhD or something and go out into society and hopefully do something useful. And it also raises those dark issues about human power as resources and civilizations of the past based on slavery, or not very long ago, in fact. And of course, the Great Civil War in the United States was really, in a lot of ways, a fight between a human-powered economy and a fossil fuel-powered one in the North. So recognizing and grappling with those issues as population as a problem, but also people as an asset, and in all of the different diverse ways, and not seeing that just as how do we funnel them all into the monetary economy to increase what economists call the participation rate, where everyone is working on the economic treadmill, which is trashing the earth, but how for people to reconfigure that capacity of humans to usefully do things that contribute to their own well-being and the well-being of others around us. Because that's, we are, one way or another, we're going to deal with these issues that way, including the aging of the population.
Absolutely. And I just want to quickly respond myself to this question of population. I think it's important to maintain a level of sensitivity around this question. Someone has mentioned that there have been many millions who have died from COVID and the pandemic. There's obviously some tricky waters around racial imperialist kind of tones and eugenics and genocide and all of that. So I guess the point for me is that our human population, kind of like you were saying, David, in my eyes, is a wellspring of potential that is being grossly abused and not honored and respected in the current design of our economy. So I feel like that extraction mentality, that throwaway mentality towards people, it informs the material design of our economy as well. So that kind of deeper essence. And I want to also acknowledge this is a women's reproductive right issue, which is very much under attack, I would say, in this country. And I just want to be mindful of that conversation as well. I want to go to the next question here from Dawn. So thinking about alternatives to gross national product, I'm wondering if David or Richard has looked deeply into the details of the genuine progress indicator or Bhutan's gross national happiness system, and whether they could be replicated and scaled. If not, why not? It's a great question, Dawn.
Right. I have looked into these. I was present at the United Nations, actually, when Bhutan made a presentation on gross national happiness, proposing that it be used increasingly by the world as a whole. And there were, some nice speeches from government ministers in places like Costa Rica, not from the United States, however. There is official interest in a few states, I believe the state of Washington and Maryland, if my memory serves me correctly, have adopted GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, at least for some of their state economic planning purposes. And these things obviously help, as we were talking about earlier. If the only thing you're measuring is the monetary economy, and that's your speedometer, and you say, well, the economy is doing well. If there's more money flowing through the economy, and therefore anything that makes that happen, monetizing more human activities, extracting more resources, and so on, well, that's what you're going to do. Whereas if you're measuring and paying attention to human well-being, environmental integrity, then you do very different things. You're measuring different things, and therefore you aim to do different things. So yes, these could be extremely helpful, and the more we can do to help those efforts, the better.
Wonderful. Over to you, David.
I don't have anything to add on that, other than I suppose I believe we've moved into a world where the slow-moving aspects of larger scale reform are so slow relative to the pace of what's happening, that I think things are working through different processes that involve what people might see as more chaotic and dark or obscure processes that do have transformative potential, but also are working against the perception of gradual, incremental displacement of things that are not useful with more useful frameworks, and that leading to incremental change. And in that, I would perhaps disagree with Richard about whether governments will ever make the huge changes necessary that would attempt to do a top-down serious response to the limits to growth, because I actually think that is the essence of what I outlined in my future scenarios work, in what I called the brown tech future, one driven by crises, where governments grab the reins again and realize they are the government as faith in market forces fail, and they respond to crises by dramatic, large-scale actions. But the stories that will characterize and are characterizing those actions are not necessarily a rational response to the limits to growth. They're typical of things like war and conflict, or I suggested they would happen in my brown tech scenario, which is one of slow decline in oil and other resources and rapid onset of climate change through things like natural disasters, where governments go, oh, we have to do something. And there's both a preparedness of populations to accept that. And I think whatever we feel about the pandemic, whatever we feel about COVID, the response of governments has actually been extraordinary in top-down responses and amazing global, if not coordination, then copying of strategies of other governments, and a preparedness to do things that actually people couldn't have imagined before. And I think that is actually a model for the sort of responses we will see to the limits to growth, but it won't be in that form. So the explanation of why we are needing to tighten our belts will range from evil other countries to nature has hit us with this or that reason, so that I see actually this quite strong top-down, what I called a command economy, which was the term used to describe the economy in the Soviet Union, where the government decides what happens and then uses, unlike the Soviet Union, uses the power of corporations to actually make that happen. So this hybrid between very strong, what people would see as a war economy or dictatorial economy, and corporate power will unfold at the same time that these more organic, bottom-up community responses will be happening in parallel. And some of the time those will be at loggerheads with each other, and some of the times they will be complementary. And so this unfolding, I think we are actually in that now, but it's very hard to see in the thick of those events. So I have to find some point where Richard and I can sort of maybe disagree on some of the points, because
only on the details, maybe.
yes.
Yeah, I have to say, I think, you know, we're at or maybe just nearing a real tipping point in all of this. If I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, I think we're in the thick of a global energy crisis right now. Mm-hmm. And that's showing up as a global food crisis. And it's inevitable at some point, this is going to show up as various forms of rationing. Hopefully it will be a kind of rationing that's well thought through, that promotes equity and so on. But I don't know. It's one way or another. You know, rationing is just taking charge of resources during times of scarcity. And we are definitely entering a time of greater scarcity of food and energy. So how governments deal with that is yet to see, but there are definitely a lot of plates up in the air right now. It's going to be interesting to see how they fall.
Absolutely. And I want to do a quick time check. We do have some more interesting questions that have been shared in the chat. Richard, David, are you able to stay on for maybe 10 minutes more? Is that possible? Or
yeah, 10 minutes is fine. Speaking of COVID, I actually have COVID right now, so my energy level is a little low. I'm coughing a lot, but you know, I'm happy to stick around for a little while.
We appreciate you sticking it through. So I want to acknowledge one question that I saw in the chat. I believe it is from a university professor, just asking how do we kind of reach young folks who have been handed a really heavy burden and an overwhelming challenge, and how do we keep them connected to the solutions? I think I saw a reference of, you know, folks feeling overwhelmed and kind of going inward or looking towards escapism, and I'm curious about both of your all's thoughts on that.
I'm happy to go first on that, because it's something I give a lot of thought to. And when I'm speaking to younger people, one of the first things I do is apologize on behalf of my generation, because I think my generation failed utterly. We had all the information we needed in the Limits to Growth report, and we didn't do what we could have done. And that's put the lives of future generations at risk, and it's undermined their prospects in all kinds of material and non-material ways. So that's the first thing I say. The second thing I say is look, if you're thoughtful and ambitious and you're interested in contributing, there's no limit to what you can do. Everything needs redesign. All of these human systems, from our food system, transportation, money, everything, all of these systems that we've created are fundamentally unsustainable. They need to be redesigned. They need your input. They need creative young people to come along and find new ways of doing things that actually work. So anyway, that's not to wiggle out from responsibility, because I think the first message is the important one, that, you know, look, we failed, but
yes, well, I have my version of what Richard was talking about in an essay, perhaps one of the more savage ones I wrote in 2019 called The Apology from Baby Boomers to the Handicapped Generations. I did get some fairly intense feedback on it, and it certainly wasn't intended to enhance the intergenerational angst that I also sort of saw playing out. But I think also I see so many young people that I connect with who are incredibly engaged and focused on building their skills, becoming useful citizens, being useful to other people, and in that process, learning and absorbing through informal ways rather than the formal systems of debt through the education system, which I regard as, in spite of good work that people still doing in those institutions, have become a way of sapping and indebting young people without giving them the skills and psychology needed for the emerging world. And so I think there are so many opportunities that are unique to this point in civilization. The fact that we have so many physical resources in the discretionary economy, which are basically won't be needed. So we are surrounded by incredible abundance of stuff. And one of the things I observe in permaculture projects around the world, more than brilliant examples of ecological agriculture or even ecological building, it's actually creative reuse of what already exists. And we don't actually have a shortage of materials, we have a shortage of skills to make use. And whether it's that the repair movement of fixing things, but transforming things into something else. And similarly, we have so many buildings. We don't need to build actually any more buildings. We need to work how to share and use and retrofit what we've got. So in that sense, there is unprecedented opportunities that come from, as this system breaks down, that actually frees up those resources. And you could see this as a more grounded bottom-up version of the idea in capitalism of creative destruction, but not destruction of things, the reuse and nurturing of something else in the wake of what's unfolding.
I really like that thought. And it also brings up composting, for example, the old system, and how can we make some energy transfers onto this new kind of life raft of culture and civilization that we need to take us forward. I'll just briefly speak as someone under 35. I also have a child, and I think one of the most supportive things that I have been able to get from elders is just encouragement and sharing of wisdom, of resources, information, and also just I also want to acknowledge the young people that really are putting in a lot of creative energy and innovating and taking on risks to really help get us through this time. And I would just also invite, our elders to join us in the dismantling work or the composting work that needs to happen, and really, really tapping into social capital or positionalities and privileges that we may have access to. And vice versa, that goes for young folks as well, and in a mutualistic kind of reciprocal pattern.
And passing along land. I mean, most of the world's land is held by, rich old people. And there are a lot of idealistic young farmers, or people who would like to be idealistic young farmers, who aren't doing that because they just don't have access to the land that they need. So if you're in that category of a landholder, figure out a way. And of course, this has to be systematic. It has to be on a larger scale, but we can start.
Yeah, one of these tensions that I identified in my retro suburbia book, and whether it's as simply as sharing one's house or on the larger scale, as Richard was talking about, incredibly important of access to land. There's deep psychosocial impediments on both sides of this question, certainly in most of the affluent countries, where older people need to learn how to pass on, share, invite younger people in, and younger people similarly need to let go of, I need to own and control something before I can actually do anything. And when I was young, people would often say, why do you do all this work on other people's land? And I'd say, well, what I learned through that process of using other people's land, other people's capital, tools, whatever, I take away from that more than I've contributed. And of course, I have to contribute something to be given that freedom to do it. But I'm gaining from that process. So I see there's impediments there for a lot of young people, and for older people, the whole issue of control and letting go is very important. But another one is being connected to people in asymmetric relationships of power and being comfortable with those. I am the landowner, right? You are a prospective tenant farmer. Yes, maybe in a different society, it would be different, but that's how it is. And being honest and transparent about navigating those relationships and understanding our own power. And I think in middle class, affluent societies, definitely in Australia, middle class people are very uncomfortable with this idea because it brings us face to face with the fact that we are not all equal. And actually having to deal with it with people that you have some close connection to is uncomfortable. And that you may have to, rather than that they would take your power away, that you might in some situation have to exercise the power you have, and that would be very distasteful. So we need to come to grips with those realities and deal with the realities rather than trying to say they don't exist or cover them up in ways. And those ways of dealing with asymmetric relationships of power are also the way to moderate the adverse effects of those, and maybe over time, for those to change.
And yeah, and over time we come up with different power structures that are more cooperative rather than hierarchical, like co-ops, which have a long history, and there are actually lots of them around. Although most people, a lot of them fly under the radar.
Absolutely. And just, I guess, on this kind of wrapping up and closing out here, just naming any models. We started discussing this modeling work of the Limits to Growth report. And just curious if there are any models or frameworks or innovations that are really inspiring either of you right now. I think of the donut economics work and the potential for that to be applied. I'm thinking of work around the rights of the earth and as a legal innovation. Just curious, what's inspiring both of you as we close out this session together?
I'm kind of drawing a blank.
Well,
I mean, we've named a bunch of stuff actually over the last hour and 10 minutes, and I think permaculture is a shining star in this firmament. It remains as a profound contribution in terms of understanding how we can, on a bottom-up basis, confront growth limits in a way that's cooperative, in a way that's earth friendly, and that makes sense intergenerationally as well. I just think it's a magnificent contribution. So thank you for that, David.
Thanks, Richard. And for me, it's interesting, after a lifetime of focusing on the ecological, energetic, rational basis of permaculture design, a lot of my inspiration now and interest is coming from storytelling. And it's interesting that in our own work in being small publishers, publishing this book by permaculture designer Linda Woodrow, 470, which is in the climate science fiction genre and is pretty gritty, gripping tale. There's also the empowering stories of how people are actually adapting. And in fact, a lot of this book is unfolding on the north coast of New South Wales at the current time with the floods that are there. And similarly, with something that I did with you years ago, my Aussie Street story has morphed into a kid's story, Our Street, of how do we sort of bring to life that imagining of something that is positive and empowering, but is actually embedded in the realities that are unfolding rather than sugarcoating that. And I'm finding a lot of both personal inspiration, but also a way of working in the world more through storytelling.
Wonderful. Thank you both. This was such a wonderful privilege and opportunity to spend this evening with you. And thank you all to the folks who tuned in. We will have a recording available and we'll make sure that is shared out. Appreciate you all.
Terrific. Thank you, Jess. Great moderation.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks, Richard.
Yeah, you too, Dave. It's great seeing you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, yes.
All right,
Hello to Sue, by
everyone.
the
Be
way.
well.
I saw her in the background. Yeah.
Yes, she wanted to say hello to you. And
Good.
Good to your family too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Be well. Take care. Wonderful. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the session.
Okay,
It's great to meet you, David.
Did I need to do anything? I pressed that record.
So once you are booted off the Zoom call, it should start converting to a saved file. Thank you so much for doing that. And don't know what's up with my Zoom interface. For some reason, it didn't have the option.
Well, you did very well dealing with that, and while talking to people and being calm.
I was trying to stay centered. I'm like, there's no need to freak out. That's not going to help.
Yes.
Similar to the limits to growth. Like, okay, channel the energy and the focus. All right. Yeah. Have a wonderful evening or morning.
Yes.
Bye.
Morning.
Have a wonderful morning. Bye.